News with Frank Reynolds. Tonight, Jules Bergman reports on the splashdown of Apollo 7 and looks toward Apollo 8. Richard Nixon and George Wallace, hecklers hurl more than insults. Bob Clark examines the senatorial race in South Dakota. Howard Cosell reports on the continuing black power struggle at the Olympic Games. And guest commentary by David Schonbrunn on his ideal presidential candidate. Now, here is Frank Reynolds.
Good evening. 3 happy Apollo 7 astronauts are resting aboard the carrier Essex tonight after splashing down in the Atlantic this morning to end their 11-day space flight. Space officials call it the perfect mission, 101% successful. ABC science editor Jules Bergman has the Apollo report.
It was just after 7 a.m. this morning when Apollo 7 splashed down in the Atlantic, only 6 miles from the aircraft carrier Essex. But fog and rain prevented anyone from seeing the landing. And since the spacecraft tipped over initially, blocking out its radio antenna, no one was sure where it was. Not until a helicopter's door opened did the nation see Wally Schirra, Don Isley, and Walt Cunningham all in good shape. 4.5 million miles in space, 163 orbits, the world's longest space trip in total man-hours, had left them unharmed. And despite fears of ruptured eardrums because of their colds, they suffered no ear damage or pain during the re-entry. A quick medical exam aboard the Essex confirmed that. After shaves and showers, they breakfasted on steak and eggs. It was the most perfect manned space flight the United States has ever flown. And even as the astronauts went below to clean up and get their medicals, the Apollo 7 spacecraft was taken aboard the Essex. The astronauts had hardly gotten below decks when President Johnson called them with the nation's congratulations.
Isley, we here in the Capitol and all over this country and the world are so very proud of you this morning. As the eyes of the earth have been opened upon you, so have the hopes of the world lifted to you. And today, despite our triumphs, we have only our fingertip on the latch that could unlock a world of miracles that are practical and profound. And from the blessings that we already hold in our hands, we know that neither complacency or conceit can stay our hand from reaching higher. So your fellow countrymen are happy to welcome all of you home with that encouragement. We salute the 3 of you, as well as the thousands of your space team headed by Mr. Webb and others in great admiration and affection. And when you have finished your debriefings, Ms. Johnson, I hope to receive you where we can talk about your experiences without having to go through the Houston switchboard. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Gordon.
And so the Apollo program has come full circle from tragedy to triumph in the 20 months since the Apollo fire. Apollo 7's all but flawless performance has cleared the way for the daring timetable America hopes to fulfill in getting to the moon. Apollo 8 is already atop at Saturn V at Launch Complex 39 at Cape Kennedy. And even as Apollo 7 circled the world, astronauts Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders were practicing in simulators what may be man's first voyage around the moon and back. We hope to do the mission before the Russians can accomplish it. The odds are now very high that Apollo 8 will be a lunar orbit flight with the spacecraft circling the moon 10 times in 20 hours. Under an alternate plan, it might fly around the moon and straight back to Earth. This would be just before Christmas. Next, Apollo 9 and the first manned test of the lunar module, the lunar bug that has to safely land 2 astronauts on the moon and return them to the Apollo mothership. That first test flight is scheduled for late February of next year. If 9 goes well, Apollo 10 will see the lunar module and Apollo flying around the moon, the crew transferring to the lunar bug and doing everything except the actual lunar landing. That flight tentatively set for May. If it has gone well, then Apollo 11 will be the first American landing on the moon, a flight that could take place as early as next July, but more likely will be in early 4. But there still are unknowns. The lunar module, untested by man. The Saturn V moon rocket facing its first manned flight. Nearly double the 4 million parts of Apollo 7 must perform reliably if the lunar mission is to be accomplished safely. Turning back 100,000 miles out from Earth will be difficult, and getting off the moon impossible if all engines don't work exactly as intended. Apollo 7's magnificent success may make it all look a bit too easy. This is Jules Bergman reporting.
Next, the latest from Vietnam and the search for peace.
Last night, Carl is so beat he forgets to feed his dog. The Purina dog chow is right there on the shelf. All he has to do is pour some in a bowl, add some warm water, and that is all. Because that is what Purina dog chow is all about. It is so complete, all you add is love. And Carl better be good at loving, because he sure ain't no good at fighting.
Flavor that beckons comes from Purina. The tastes that cats like best. Milk, meat, chicken, and fish, all blended into Purina Cat Chow. For cats who love flavor, for people who love cats.
Today, for the first time in 2 months, North Vietnamese units shelled the Marine Divisional Headquarters at Dong Ha, 8 miles below the demilitarized zone. 3 Marines and 3 South Vietnamese civilians were killed. Damage otherwise was said to be slight. American planes continued their attacks on enemy supply routes above the demilitarized zone. Nevertheless, despite this military action, rumors persist that some movement toward peace talks is near. In Saigon, President Nguyen Van Thieu met again today with United States Ambassador Ellsworth Bunker, their 5th meeting since last Wednesday. After today's conference, Thieu issued a statement saying that he does not oppose a halt to the bombing of the North, provided there is good reason to believe that North Vietnam will de-escalate the war and enter into talks with the Saigon government. And in Paris, French Foreign Minister Michel Debré, after a meeting with President de Gaulle, said President Johnson's recent moves in Vietnam were courageous. And Debré said, "We can see its fruit these days." Tomorrow, American and North Vietnamese negotiators will meet again in Paris for their 27th confrontation. It is possible we may learn more then about the prospects for a bombing halt. However, ABC diplomatic correspondent John Scally reports a downturn in optimism in Washington. It had been hoped, indeed in some quarters expected, that a favorable response would come from the North Vietnamese last weekend. As each day goes by with no official word from Hanoi, prospects for a breakthrough to peace appear less bright. ABC's Charles Murphy reports that in Spartanburg, South Carolina late today, General Curtis LeMay, the vice presidential candidate on the ticket with George Wallace, warned the American people to expect a peace gesture. And LeMay said it will be a bombing halt or a ceasefire. He said the gesture will come from Washington or Hanoi, and he said it will be intended to influence the voter. In LeMay's words, the voter will be asked to believe that the Humphrey-Nixon line is at last bringing peace. In Oshkosh, Wisconsin today, George Wallace told a rather disorderly rally that the leaders of the Republican and Democratic parties have, in his words, kowtowed to anarchists, but have ignored the wishes of millions of other Americans. Hecklers threw eggs, vegetables, and fruit at Wallace as he stood on a flatbed truck. An apple core struck the candidate on the shoulder. Wallace said, "That's all right, it'll wash off." And referring to the crowd, or some members of the crowd, he said, "That's just a bunch of anarchists." In Springfield, Ohio today, during a whistle-stop campaign trip, Richard Nixon was also the target of an object thrown from his audience. Apparently, Mr. Nixon was not hit by the unidentified object. Newsmen reported that he flinched. Secret Service agents quickly stepped in front of the candidate and Mrs. Nixon and escorted them back inside the railroad car. Some witnesses thought a small rock had been thrown at Mr. Nixon. Others believe it was debris that fell apart when it hit the railing in front of where he was standing. The person who threw the object apparently escaped. Apart from that incident, the Nixon Victory Special, the train, has been a rather nostalgic remembrance of campaigns past. Details now from ABC's Lou Cioffi.
For 247 miles and through 9 cities and towns, the Nixon Victory Special rolled along the Ohio countryside. It's become a sentimental journey for candidates in this age of jets and television, the whistle-stop tour. The crowds that greeted Nixon were fairly large, and he addressed them from the back platform of his train in the best whistle-stop style.
And I know, of course, in this we enter these next weeks of the campaign, that we've heard our opponent on the other side say that he's going to campaign and win like Harry Truman. Well, my friends, all I can say, it isn't going to work, because it's one thing to give him Truman, and it's one thing to give him hell, but it's something else to give him Humphrey.
Despite the air of confidence that surrounds Nixon, he's well aware of the fact that the Humphrey campaign is picking up support. In Ohio, for instance, private soundings indicate that this state, with its 26 electoral votes, is not yet safely in the Nixon win column. He's hoping that this tour will help. There are danger signs from other areas, and Nixon himself asserts that these last 2 weeks will decide victory or defeat. During this time, Richard Nixon is going to concentrate on the 8 big industrial states. They have 227 of the 270 electoral votes he needs for election. He remembers that in 1960 he lost 6 of them, and now he's going to make sure that history does not repeat itself. This is Lou Cioffi, ABC News, with the Nixon campaign in Ohio.
Spiro Agnew says he will concentrate on Vice President Humphrey in the closing days of the campaign, but during his speech in Midland, Texas last night, Agnew attacked George Wallace and Curtis LeMay and said he would be desperately afraid to see the third-party candidates in power. In a moment, the Democrats, and a special report on the Senate race in South Dakota.
My fellow citizens, it's time we face this fact. Ocean Spray Cranapple juice tastes mostly like apple. Cranapple juice is delicious, but that's because of the apple, not the cran. The apple, yummy, sweet, trustworthy apple. Friends, this noble juice should be called apple cran, not cran apple. A vote for me is a vote for apple cran.
And here we are at Cranberry headquarters. Our next interview...
Ladies and gentlemen of the press, my opponent, the Honorable Apple, wants to rename Ocean Spray Cranapple juice. He wants to call it Apple Cran. Balderdash! The cranberry gives cranapple its flavor, its tang, its character, and its cheery red color. Cranapple. Apple wants to call it apple cran. Never! Don't put the apple before the cran.
Vice President Humphrey said today that Richard Nixon won't debate him because, in the Vice President's words, he doesn't want to expose a public record that is against the people. Mr. Humphrey told his audience in Fort Worth, Texas, that he's not discouraged by polls that show he is trailing Mr. Nixon, because, the Vice President said, there is a great deal of difference and disagreement among the pollsters themselves. Senator George McGovern of South Dakota was not really a nationally known figure until his brief campaign for the Democratic presidential nomination. In Chicago, however, he became rather famous, and after the convention, it was widely assumed outside his state that he would not have any great difficulty winning re-election to the Senate. That is not necessarily the case, as we learn in this report on the South Dakota senatorial race from ABC's Bob Clark.
South Dakota seems far removed from the crises of the cities and the war in Vietnam and the anger that boils over much of the rest of the country in this election campaign, but it's not. There's a seething discontent among voters here, partly because of the special problems and frustrations of the Farm Belt, such as how much cattle like these are going to bring when they get to the marketplace, but because of a lot of other things, too. The irony of George McGovern's battle for re-election is that most people here don't blame him for the things they're mad about, but he may be swept up and tossed out of office by a Republican resurgence swirling across the South Dakota plains. Polls show McGovern running ahead of his opponent, Archie Gubrud, a popular former governor, but polls are misleading in this state where the balloting process encourages voting a straight party ticket. This makes it hard for McGovern to run far ahead of Hubert Humphrey, and Humphrey is trailing Nixon in the same polls by a whopping 25%.
Some political observers here in South Dakota who feel that you would be stronger running on your own, that Hubert Humphrey is just a drag on your kite. Do you have any concern about this?
Well, the polls indicate that I'm running considerably stronger than the vice president, but I think a person has to take a stand on these presidential races. You can't really duck that one. And for me to be silent on the vice president's bid would be a way of saying indirectly that I have no preference as between him and Mr. Nixon and Mr. Wallace, and that's just not true. I do prefer Vice President Humphrey to the other two major candidates, however much I might disagree with them on 2 or 3 issues.
Gubrud, a successful farmer and cattle feeder himself, gets along well with farmers and ranchers. With farm prices the lowest in 20 years in relation to farmers' costs, and wheat selling for $1.28 a bushel, its lowest price in 25 years, about all the Republican candidate has to do is listen as farmers air their complaints. He's a moderate on Vietnam, but he accuses McGovern of giving aid and comfort to the enemy with his dovish views.
This administration is so divided. You've got the president with one policy and a bunch of these well-known senators going in an entirely different direction, and nobody knows where Humphrey is. And communists know this. And as long as they know that, why, they aren't going to negotiate in good faith or make any concessions. But I think if we get an administration that'll show some leadership, why, I think we can get the job done, but this too isn't going to be easy. And I think any politician that says that you can do this, that, and or something else, and your problems will all be solved, they're just kidding somebody. But I still think we can get the job done.
McGovern, a former college professor, draws on some of the same student power that helped McCarthy and Robert Kennedy in their campaigns. His re-election prospects are also helped by a resurgence of this state's traditional isolationist sentiment, as hawks who once opposed his views on Vietnam grow disenchanted with the war and closer to McGovern's own views. In his battle for political survival, McGovern is fighting all alone, or almost. He doesn't want any help from Lyndon Johnson, who couldn't give him any anyway. Hubert Humphrey's been here, but his coattails aren't long enough to elect any Democrat this year in South Dakota. So, with his Republican opponent riding that Republican wave, McGovern is going to have to win this one all alone. And it looks like a very close election. This is Bob Clark in South Dakota.
President Johnson signs a gun control bill and calls for a stronger one. That story in a moment.
This is an act of courage for some denture wearers. And this is Orifix denture adhesive, the seal of confidence. It can give you a good laugh.
Oh.
You're going to look a little terrible tonight. And Albaline cream is going to be why. Frankly, Albaline is oil, pure and simple. Because pure oil is the best way to clean your face without drying it. Albaline soaks the skin to help slow down wrinkles and keep your skin young-looking. You don't want to look a little older tomorrow? Use Albaline cream and look a little terrible tonight.
President Johnson signed into law today gun control legislation that bans the mail-order sale of rifles, shotguns, and ammunition. Even while signing the bill, the president expressed his disappointment at the limited scope of the new law. He said it falls short of what is needed for effective gun control and crime control. The president said the new bill is weak because it does not contain 2 things he asked Congress to include: registration of weapons and licensing of owners. And Mr. Johnson blamed the weakness of the bill on powerful gun lobbies active in this election year. Thousands of students in Tokyo seized a busy railroad station today. It was the second big demonstration staged against American involvement in the war in Vietnam. Last night, over 2,000 red-helmeted students attacked the National Defense Agency in Tokyo with battering rams. Police used water cannons to try and disperse the students. Finally, hundreds of Tokyo police waded into the students, protected by large shields. And when it was over, almost everybody was wet. and at least 240 of the students were arrested. There were many injuries in this riot in Tokyo last night. In a moment, commentary by Howard Cosell from the Olympic Village in Mexico City.
This is a molecular model of poly-1,4-cyclohexylene dimethylene terephthalate. How about that? And I'm Joanna Barnes here to tell you what this unique molecule of Codel polyester fiber means in carpets. It's so special, it's patented. Every room in your house comes alive because carpets of Codel bounce back beautifully. Even a house full of kids can't keep Codel fiber down. That's why Codel is the fastest growing carpet fiber. If you can't remember the name Codel, ask for poly-1,4-cyclohexylene dimethylene terephthalate.
We also make 2,2,4-trimethyl-1,3-pentane diol monoisobutyrate.
But that doesn't go in carpets.
Codel fiber has bounced back. Built-in.
Count on Codel, a member of the Eastman Kodak family.
The American Olympic team in Mexico City has won an impressive number of gold medals and should add to that collection before the games are over. But the excitement of the United States athletic victories has been dimmed somewhat by the racial controversy that took place last week. ABC sports editor Howard Cosell offers these comments.
I'm standing in the center of the Olympic Village here in Mexico City. To the rear, building number 11, is the American building. And with the track and field events of this, the 19th Olympiad, over, things have apparently simmered down. But I use the word apparently advisedly because they have simmered down only to the naked eye. The feeling, and there is great rejoicing here among the U.S. Olympic Committee officials, the feeling is that the Americans have done so very well, and they talk about all the gold medals the Americans have won, and they like to make believe that what happened during the past week never happened really. They like to believe that the black athlete once and for all has backed down. I can tell you he has not backed down. I can tell you that Tommy Smith and John Carlos, although the weight of American public opinion is against them, have not changed one bit, and I must say that Smith has comported himself with tremendous dignity. And I've just spoken with Lee Evans, and I can tell you that these men are well aware that of 15 gold medals captured in track and field, the black athletes won 10 of them. They're well aware of the fact that when they go back to the country, they begin all over again for their fight for racial justice as they see it. And they're well aware of the fact that when Jesse Owens went back to America in 1936, he had to race against a horse in a public exhibition to make a few bucks. They are determined that this will not happen to them. Howard Cosell reporting from the Olympic Village in Mexico City.
ABC continues its coverage of the Olympic Games tonight with a 30-minute report at 9:30, 8:30 Central Time, and then a 90-minute summary of the day's events at 11:30, 10:30 Central Time. On the New York Stock Exchange today, Dow Jones Industrials were down more than 4 points. More than 13.5 million shares were traded. The New York Stock Exchange Index was down 17 cents. On the American Stock Exchange, nearly 5.5 million shares were traded. The American Exchange Index was down 4 cents. In a moment, guest commentator David Schoenbrunn gives his view of the ideal president.
This crystal is clear. Clear floor wax is crystal clear on your floors. Clear goes on clear, dries clear, stays clear. And it never yellows. Lets all the natural beauty of your floors show through brilliantly. Clear, the crystal clear look.
Lemon pledge, very pretty. Put the shine down lemon good. Lemon pledge as you're dusting brings new luster to the wood. Lemon pledge gleams so easy. Lemon way to make wood glow. Lemon pledge as you're dusting adds protection as you go.
New from Johnson Wax.
Last night, we presented the first of a series of commentaries on the ideal president. Tonight, guest commentator David Schoenbrunn offers his views.
The office of the presidency has grown so powerful, its responsibilities so critical, that we yearn for a kind of philosopher king. But to yearn for such an ideal president dooms us to disappointment, for such men are rare if they ever did truly exist. What a democracy needs is not a man for all peoples and all times, but a man to meet a particular problem at a particular time. The right man for the right moment. Churchill was such a man in World War II, the unconquerable warrior. But the British voted him out of office at the very moment of triumph, for they sensed that a warrior was not a man to rebuild Britain in peace. The French did the same thing with de Gaulle, whom they forced out of office at the liberation and then brought back to liberate Algeria. We ourselves turned to Eisenhower to end the war in Korea, then Kennedy to get the country moving again. And now we need a man to solve the problems of our times: war, racism, law, order, justice, and confidence in government to close the great credibility gap. Trouble is, many of us fear none of the present candidates is such a man. Wallace is a spoiler. As for Humphrey and Nixon, why, they failed to inspire confidence or even much enthusiasm. We are told that we must choose the lesser of two evils. It might be more accurate to say that we are facing the evil of two lessers, for neither man seems big enough. Perhaps that's because we hunger so for greatness. I would suggest that we've forgotten that the quality of leadership can't be much better than the quality of citizenship. Unless all citizens participate fully in the democratic process, unless they demand peace and justice, then they're likely to get the president they deserve, not the president they need. This is David Schoenbrunn for ABC News.
Tomorrow, guest commentator Maria Manis gives her view of the ideal president. That's tonight's news and comment. I'm Frank Reynolds. Good night.
Of ABC News. Link is torn between